what does the government panel do then? There's sort of four areas that we'll cover this evening. I'll go through some history and background to the panel and a few thoughts about the future. And then we will have two panel members to give you a bit of talk about their experience. My credentials then as the chair of the government panel, I've basically had two careers in the public sector. The first was in the Air Force, so in the armed forces, for over 20 years. And then my second was in central government, working as a civil servant, initially in Ofsted for 18 months, and then for nearly 16 years in the Cabinet Office, doing a range of different jobs on policy, on IT, on corporate support, and various other things. But as you'll come to see, quite a lot of the members of the panel actually don't have a public sector or background, and that's part, I think, of our attraction, is finding out about that. So a little bit of history and background then. As I mentioned just now, the panel was formed in 2008. It meets, before we got caught in the pandemic, we try and meet 6 times a year and run 5 or 6 events a year, including 1 or 2 larger events. We've done dinners in the past and that sort of thing. And I'll say a little bit more about them as we go along. Before we sort of talking about what the panel does, it's perhaps worth getting clear in our mind what government covers, and therefore what potentially the panel could cover. The term government is used extremely loosely by people to cover a number of different things. And I've indicated here all the areas that we could identify that form part of government in the UK. Clearly there is central government, and you've got the picture of number 10 then as the Prime Minister, where he's based. But you've also got the devolved governments in the 3 other nations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Local government, you've got a huge amount of different aspects of local government, with county councils, borough councils, city councils out there, and these are replicated in the other parts of the UK, not just in England. And we mustn't forget that the fire and rescue services are also linked into local government delivery as well. Then, of course, you've got the National Health Service, which has been very prominent in the last year or so. And we're talking about over 1 million people employed in the National Health Service. And I think they say that the health service is bigger than the Red Army was at its peak. So that gives you an idea of the scale of the health service alone. Then, of course, we've got education, some of which is delivered through local government, but not all. Police, the armed forces, where I was. And then there are a number of agencies or non-departmental public bodies, NDPBs, or perhaps, as some of you know them, as Quangos, or perhaps that term's out of date now. And what we mustn't forget is that many of these aspects of government have regulatory or supervisory powers. So they impact or can impact upon us in day-to-day life. Just 2 examples: the Charity Commission, if any of you are involved with charities, or the Food Standards Agency, if any of you are involved there. So the point I'm making here is government is a very general term, and taken at its widest, it is a hugely broad remit. So we need to refine that down a bit. But before we try and refine it down a bit, a little bit more on the size and the scale of government. Now, this slide here, the structure, we are only talking about central government. This doesn't take in any of the other parts of government that we were talking about. So 23 ministerial departments, a further 20 like Ofsted, who don't have their own ministers. And then the Quangos, agencies, NDPBs, etc., 30 of those. An important fact to bear in mind is the distinction between a public servant and a civil servant. When we're talking about the total breadth of everything that I mentioned in government, we are talking about public servants, and we're talking over 5.5 million people employed in the public sector. Civil servants are specifically those employed by central government, mostly Whitehall, but there are some parts of government departments that are outside of London itself, so not necessarily just in Whitehall. So again, and taken together with the previous slide, you know, there is a huge breadth of remit for government, multiplicity of areas that it's involved, and lots of people involved. In fact, in some areas of the country, there are a greater percentage of people who are public sector employees than are employed in the private sector, which is an interesting perspective. Some of you will recognise the picture of Sir Humphrey Appleby on the right there, the permanent secretary of the Department of Administrative Affairs. For those of you who remember just Minister and then eventually just Prime Minister, and if you don't remember, it's on at 8 o'clock this evening, so if you want to catch up with it. If you did see it, you will remember this was a hugely funny programme about the operation of a department within central government. But I think the essential thing about the comedy was that it took real life situations and stretched the boundaries of credibility, but kept it reasonably credible. So it didn't go too far. And that was why it was funny. And the point I'm trying to make here is everything that they portrayed may not have happened exactly to that extent, but it's all based on things that did happen before. The script writers themselves didn't work in government, but they had very close contacts with government. And perhaps the other thing to say is that that programme now is nearly 40 years old. In fact, I think most of the principal actors have all died since then. But my point again here is that although it's 40 years old, what it's saying hasn't changed in that time and is worth thinking about. Philip Virgo, who's sitting somewhere out there, has commented that he sees this more as a training programme for senior civil servants and ministers than as a comedy programme. I think I see it, perhaps because I was involved in government, I see more the comedy side of it. But anyway, you can talk about that later if you want to. So then coming back to ourselves, the government panel, what do we try to do then? So we try to be the principal point of focus for discussion of government IT issues, to help other panels to understand government, to advise other panels within the company on government and IT related issues, and where appropriate to work with government. I think it's important to say that we do less on understanding government at the moment and more about specific issues, but that's something that we're thinking about. We perhaps need to do more on the understanding government side, and perhaps something you may want to pick up in a Q&A session afterwards. So in short, you know, we seek to be a centre of expertise and learning, and to develop a knowledge repository of government information available to other members of the company. And I think the other thing to stress is that we are not a lobbying organisation, and I think that is our strength, because we are perceived both within and without of the company as neutral, as an independent player, so that which gives us greater status, I think, in that area. So I think the message here is that government impacts upon everything we do, and IT is essential to that. So we've still got this issue of what does the government panel try and focus down on, as we are not going to be able to cover all of it. So the first thing is that if there's another committee or panel that has a specific interest in an area, then we let that panel lead. We're more than happy to support them if they want it, but they take the lead. So for instance, the Education Committee has been doing a lot on the skills side. We have in the past done an event on the Learning Grid for London, and may well do another one in conjunction with the Education Committee there. We try and focus on those issues that are sort of current at the time, and I'll come back to one or two of those later. or we try and focus on issues that are not likely to be covered by a single panel, but maybe overlap across a number of panels. Like many of the panels and committees, we carried out a strategy review in 2016, and we identified as our sort of 4 functions to educate within the company and maybe outside, to provide a trusted source of advice, and then the last 2, fellowship and the charity side of it, it will be common to most panels and committees. And perhaps that's where we put the plug in now, that for all of our events, when we run them, if we do refreshments and such, we try to make a small profit, and the profit goes into the charity. For some of the larger events, we make a specific donation to the charity. Tonight is of course free, but if anybody would like to make a donation to the charity, that would be very much appreciated. So the question is, how do we go about then trying to provide this focus? Firstly, running informative events, either on current IT issues, and we've singled out here the event we ran just before Christmas last year on internet government, and the one in the new year on IR35, which if anybody's involved in that area, you'll be familiar with. And we also, a couple of years ago, ran a very interesting event on the likely impact of Brexit, much of which has proved to be true. So if there are current issues, or let's focus in on IT, how IT is used within government. So we had run an event on IT in the Royal Air Force several years ago. We ran one a couple of years ago on information warfare on the Royal Navy. And then we will be doing one on the Army, a bit more about that in a minute. Another area type of activity that we've done is roundtable discussions. So these we have run in the hall with somewhere like 15, 20, maybe 25 people around the table there. This is all by invitation, but bringing in people who have a specific interest in an area. So the first one we did was on broadband in London. There was a published report came out of this. There was no action from the company's point of view came out of this, but the benefit of this was that there were a number of key players who did not necessarily know the issues that were that their fellow players had in this area, and they were able to get together afterwards and at least remove some of the barriers in that area. So we thought that was a success. We've also tried to do one on IT for exporters, and we ran the workshop on that. That was less of a success because most of those in the industry seem to be taking the view, let's wait and see what happens at Brexit. So we struggled to get any momentum around that one. As I sort of hinted at earlier, we're thinking about running a series of events on demystifying government for the benefit of those who don't understand government, and I'll come back to that in a bit more detail in a minute. We also have links with other panels and committees, and I've mentioned the education one already. And as I mentioned earlier, we are progressively building up this repository of knowledge, which I think some of that stuff is still on the website, but these days we're using our Teams capability to do more with that. But if anybody's got an issue that they wonder if we might have some information on and they can't find it, then just drop me an email. My email will be at the end, and we can see if we can help you out with that, especially if you're struggling to find your way around Teams, as I know some people are. I mentioned demystifying government. This is an area that we've been thinking about for a while now, that maybe people struggle to understand this, and thinking about it, even those of us who have been involved in government only understand the bit that we've worked in, and all the other aspects, you know, that I listed earlier on have different cultures, different ways of working. So the fact that I worked in a central government department does not mean to say that other government departments work in exactly that way. So what we're thinking of doing is running a series of events, getting speakers in to tell us how their particular departments work. So that people who may be interested in what they do or working with them have a better idea of how to go about it. And I think one of the key things is knowing how to find the right people to deal with in government who have the authority. And you'll probably find quite a few who think they have the authority. The key is to finding those who really have the authority. And in some cases, that's the elected representative, and in some cases it isn't. And again, that can be an interesting challenge to try and work out. The other side of the coin is, especially when you're dealing with officials, is to be able to bring something to the table yourself and not to expect that there are free lunches to be given out. So this is a sort of new area that we're working on. And the other thing that I forgot to mention is the series of articles that I've run in Monitor, and there'll be another one coming out shortly. But clearly you can only sort of touch the tips of the iceberg with this, and an event would allow us to do more in a specific area. But you might like to feed back to us on that when we get to the Q&A session at the end. So other future events, I mentioned the demystifying government. Digital Soldier will be coming up later in the year. This will be an online event. As I said, we've done the Air Force and the Navy, so it's the Army's turn, but this will actually be about the strategic, the tactical end of the Army at the front line, and we'll probably run an event later on the strategic side. We are planning to run a dinner later this year, probably in October, in conjunction with the IT and Climate Panel, Climate Change Working Group, on an environmental regulation aspect. So look out for information on that. We've also been working on something on AI and democracy, with all the disinformation and fake news that's going around these days. We had started that before lockdown, but lockdown has held that up, because that's an event that we feel that we would want to run as a live event. We've got a sponsor to provide a big venue for us. But of course, that's all on hold until we can get back together. So I don't think we will be running that again until next year. Perhaps just brief mention about membership of the panel itself. We have about 60 people on our distribution list, so they get information about panel events in addition to that coming out in the normal communications within the company. And I have a core of 10 people who sort of we've been working together online since MS Teams came available to progress the activities of the panel, and that's proved a godsend since we went into lockdown. But we're always happy for one or two more people to join us if they're interested in becoming involved in the organisation and running of our events. I think that's probably enough from me. What we're planning to do now is to have two of our panel members to give you their experiences. Welcome, John. Okay, can I pass over to you then, John?
Can. Yes, so John Gavin, I've been in the company 25 years this year. I know it probably doesn't look like it. I'm just wearing my government panel meeting attire this evening. Actually, I'm going to a virtual birthday celebration after this, but we usually we're fairly formal, in a very informal way. Now, the thing about the government panel, which I think it offers something very special in the company, is that I mean, my background has been working with finance, and mostly finance in the city, and then overseas with some national governments. And the reality of it is that you come across the influence of the government, of the British government, absolutely everywhere. From when you're doing an inward investment project in Trinidad, because they've adopted government standards over there with regard and models. Some of the work they do are in their government very closely on what we do, how our government works, to the fact if you're dealing with an investment bank in the city, because clearly regulation is the long arm of government. So back in 1996, it was one of the areas of key interest, because I think that the technology industry has not been particularly good at its relationship with government over many years. And if you remember back in those times, it was the time that the Millennium Dome was commissioned, that Dolly the sheep came into existence, the BSC crisis was the crisis of the day, and the Docklands bombing took place. And I mean, the fact was then the key issue was around broadband access, a lot of which we take for granted now. When you actually look at the real drivers behind broadband access and the people who, or the group that really pushed it and put that technology out and drove companies to do it, it was through government. So, you know, our industry, the technology we take for granted today, a lot of that has been pushed through by government. Now, to understand exactly which departments pushed and moved it is a real science. But what we do in the panel is to get some insight into the mystical ways in which they work. If we get the banking crisis in 2008, 2009, which I think we can all remember pretty clearly, well, quite a few of us can. And, you know, at the time we saw banks falling off the end of cliffs, left, right and centre, the end of the world as we know it. And fortunately, Gordon Brown opened his checkbook and saved the day. I think whatever chancellor or brand of chancellor it would have been, they probably would have worked in the same way. But again, government was the backstop and government actually prevented that collapse. And so this inextricable linkage with government is something that even now to the pandemic, we can see how they've taken over the whole leadership and direction of the way we're going. Now, the reality of this is, do we really understand how this works? And we should all do that. Fortunately, on the panel, we do have people like Philip, who has immense insight into some of these areas. And if you ever need to know anything about government, I would strongly suggest drop a note to Philip, because he does seem to have this infinite set of wisdom that's been built up over years. But by getting to talk to people within government, we as a livery company actually understand how it works. And I think they get some very positive feedback from us. And the particular example I'll give is the when we had the representative from the Navy, from Navy Intelligence, and he was quite amazed how we worked and how we work with industry, and clearly industry intrigued him as the same way as government intrigued me. So I would encourage you wholeheartedly, those of you who are not members of the panel, to join. And I would, and what it's going to deliver you is insight, and understanding, and a lot of very, very interesting discussion as well. So on that note, I would say that I will now hand over to my colleague Glenn, who's going to give you the new member insight. So, Glenn.
Thanks, John. And I know you've got to disappear now, but thanks for that.
I have. Any questions, send them on a postcard.
Glenn, over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you, John. I apologise, I'm not as well dressed as John. I don't have a dinner or a virtual birthday to go to afterwards. So I've been a member of the panel for well over a year now, Jeff, into 2 years, I think. And like John, I was attracted because of the issues of the day. And for me, that was more along the lines of Brexit, the IR35 changes, which have affected me personally as well, because I work as a contractor within financial services, and also the increased focus on technology within industry. So especially around critical infrastructure and how the government plays its part with that. And also Internet of Things, and more currently, how technology is playing its part for test and trace. This huge project that's going off for testing and tracing for the coronavirus. And That's a huge amount of data and a lot of computing power behind it. So there's lots of interesting topics that have come up whilst I've been a member of the government panel, and I think there will be more interesting topics coming along throughout the next year or so. We never seem to be short of how technology is helping to shape government. It has been extremely attractive to me. I don't have a massive background in government. I've worked in industry for 20 years now. Occasionally I do come across various government departments and have had the occasional government contract which has lasted for a few months. But unfortunately I don't have the heavy insight like Jeff and Philip have, who I do consider veterans of government. But it has been nice to liaise with such people, and that kind of real world experience that we get when we run these events. And I do find the events incredibly exciting. They're a great experience, and it's not always just the topic of the events, and certainly pre-pandemic, it's those fringe conversations that you have while you're waiting for the main event or while you're having the canopies. Those kind of conversations with former members of government, various individuals from the armed forces who come along to these meetings, that those fringe conversations are really important and add a lot of value and really bring to life some of the challenges and problems that government is facing with technology. And like John was saying, a lot of these individuals may not come from our industry, and they also find it very fascinating what we do as well. And that's where the real value has come for me with those kind of events, not always just the topic itself, but those fringe conversations as well. It's also inspired me to go looking more at government and how we can help government, how we can take our knowledge out to government. I joined a number of panels outside of the livery, a number of forums, including the All Parliamentary Group for Cybersecurity, and I've tried to get myself more involved in government to try and take the skills and the knowledge that we have and play that back to government so that we can start to get that message back to them. So it's been a really interesting thing for me to do, to get involved in this. It's inspired me a lot. Listening to people like Jeff and Philip has inspired me a lot to reach out to government and see how we can give something back to government and give our insights of industry back to them. So it's been really positive for me. I'm really glad I joined. I think I looked at quite a few panels before I joined the government panel, and this was perhaps the one where I felt I could probably get the most value out of learning something new. So it's been really good for me.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks for your kind words, but I must stress that government is so broad that even people like Philip and myself, who have experience of dealing probably with numbers of bits of it, there are still bits of it which are black holes to us in the way that they work. So there are still things for us to learn as well. Right, so thank you very much for that. Then we're sort of coming towards the end of the presentation now. So thank you to John and Glenn for that. So my question to you, you may remember in the publicity for this event, there were sort of 4 questions, you know. Would you like to know how we work? Are you interested in being kept up to date? Hopefully we have been able to do something towards answering those questions for you. And if you think that you might like to find out more, maybe interested in coming along and joining us for an event, or even getting more involved with the panel. I'll just put up, if anybody does want to contact me, my Wicket email address there is jeff.sadler, and the obvious the bits there. I will stop sharing now so I can see all of you and open it. I invite you to unmute yourselves and invite you to raise any questions that you may wish to do so at this stage. I can also see one on the, I'm just going to pick up one. There's one question here from, Peter Bailey. Is it? He's just asking, we have one member in GCHQ, do we have others elsewhere in IT government roles? not that I'm specifically aware. One of the things I have to say is that I retired 11 years ago. So some of the people I'm now with, on Used to Know, should I say, have themselves retired or moved on and lost contact. I think the question that Peter raises here about where people work is actually a broader issue than just government, isn't it? It's about the information we hold on members, but I know that is being addressed. Right, I did see a couple of hands go up. Rosie, I think, was the first one. Rosie, would you like to kick things off then?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much for a very informative presentation. It's really, really insightful, very useful indeed. My question is, you touched on the fact that we're apolitical and not really lobbyists, but how much, I suppose, not the word power, but how much strength do we have as influencers from WCIT and the government panel back to the government to say, hey, we've got a bright idea kind of thing? And, you know, do we have that kind of oomph, I suppose, is the word.
Philip, go on then, yes.
That we have the position we have is that we do not try and do that. Politicians, officials have people lobbying at them from all directions all the time with bright ideas and vested interests. What they don't have is cool discussions where you're more concerned to try and ensure that they've got the information available, and they, to put it succinctly, they know who's lobbying for what, why, and whether it matters, in my concern, to their constituency or whose constituency. It's the refusal to try and lobby for or against something, which is, I think, why it's so easy for me, for example, to get guests along to a roundtable or event across political boundaries, across official boundaries, to be candid about how they are going to look at a difficult area.
And I think, thank you for that, Philip. I think what I would add is that that's exactly what the situation we've been in as the government panel. There are other panels and committees who have their own specific links into government, and they may be taking a slightly different angle on that, especially since they're dealing with some very specific issues where they may have the expertise and they may be perceived in that light. But yes, thank you for that. Was there somebody else's hand up? Oh, Master, yes, please.
Just to avoid finding myself. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. I just wanted to draw your attention, if you're not already aware, to somewhere where you make the point you might have contacts. It occurs to me that, I don't know whether you know, but we have an initiative on digital poverty, which I think has some government interest for obvious reasons. And it may be that you could perhaps base with Jason Scott Taggart. And I'll mention it to him because I need to call him just to see whether there is some influence or whatever that you might have that might be useful to him. The second area is the issue of social value, which I'm sure you know is now becoming more and more important in government contracts, being led by Rob Versitz. Same sort of point. We have, I think, the first meeting of members of the social value group in April, which has, I think, 2 people from the Cabinet Office talking about how government sees social value, which is quite good. But again, there may be some input there. And when you come on to AI, I think you certainly should talk to Maxine Ricketts about, you know, what she's doing in the charity sector and what overlap there might be there. As a couple of suggestions, IT for exporters might be back on the agenda, I suspect.
Well, yes.
Might be worth a second try, although I don't know how many people in the company are actually doing any exporting, but that's a lot. The other thing I thought might be interesting, which is you know, one always wonders about IT in the NHS. Always gets bad press. Should it, you know, is it a huge intractable problem? I think it'd be really interesting to have a speaker about that.
And well, we've got a contact who's on this call now. Rosie is a very new, yeah, no, I'm not trying to embarrass you, Rosie, but Rosie is a very new member of the panel, a relatively new member of the company with good NHS background. We have had this conversation. But of course, we've also got the medicine and healthcare panel as well. So again, this is something that I've suggested we might be doing jointly with them. But yes, you're right. Yeah.
You mentioned,
really
Master, the digital poverty, digital exclusion. It's interesting that, in fact, within the company, one of our members is sitting on and trying to coordinate some of the most important research into who actually is excluded, how, why, and the rest of it. And I am trying to get that individual, I'm taking care not to disclose that even their gender, to actually help with an event to actually better inform people as to what is actually known from the various research programs around the UK. But it's really quite interesting just how much expertise there is in various areas within the company that is potentially tappable, provided we get the event right.
Well, I think I think that applies in many areas. What I think is useful, and one of the reasons I've been attending these, is just to try and join a few more people up, which is why I mentioned the 3 things that I did, because, you know, you may already be in touch, which is great, but if not, there could well be worth having a conversation, even if it goes nowhere, because at least they know who to contact, you know, maybe at a different or right moment, so to speak.
Yeah.
I have had a brief conversation with Jason Scott Taggart, but that was a while ago now, so it may be that it's time for an update.
Well, I think if you haven't spoken to him, or the time you spoke to him was before the webinar we had, I mean, that made quite a big leap forward. And I think, I'm just trying to remember what he told me last week, but I think there is a government contact going on, and I'm not sure whether that was initiated by somebody in government or Jason found somebody, or so there is definitely something going on between us and the government and other actors in this story.
Oh yes, that's right, and I mean that's true of other panels and committees as well, isn't it? I mean, cybersecurity have good links, education have, and others as well. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for that, Master. Does anybody else have a question they wish to raise at this stage? Ian, yes, please.
I recollect a few years ago, the Ethical and Spiritual Development Panel looked at the whole idea.
You're very quiet.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm good. I recollect that a few years ago, the Ethical and Spiritual Development Panel looked at the issue of fake news in politics and a democracy. We had a seminar, I think, about it, but not a lot happened since. But I wonder if the government panel had picked that up and were aware of it.
Actually, that was the event that was in Lincoln's Inn, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right.
Yes, and that was done jointly with us, with the Ethical and Spiritual and the government panel. Yeah, that's the driver, or thinking about how we might take that on, is about this AI and democracy event that we are working on, but unfortunately has had to go on hold because we think that there is potential for a lot of interest in that one. So it's something that bigger than just running in the hall. John Gavin actually had a venue organised before lockdown started over a year ago, and so we've held off, and we will look to do that, and that'll probably be next year, because venues like that are not taking bookings yet. And I should stress that we've been offered this venue free, so it's a bonus. And we've got a potential to run an opportunity on a really interesting event on a large scale, and also make it a fundraiser for the charity as well. So yes, keep your eyes open, but it will be next year before something on those lines happens. Yeah. Right. Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We'll see you sometime in the future.